Hello everybody, this is Mithril Zenith, and welcome back to another weapon discussion. Today we are talking about one of the most interesting ideas explored in a Fire Emblem game once and never again, the cards. Specifically the Spectre card, Reaper card, and Daemon card from Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn. Now, before we can truly discuss this, a little bit of history. Fire Emblem used to combine strength and magic into one stat. The first game to deviate from this was Fire Emblem 4, Genealogy of the Holy War, where all units had both a strength and a magic stat. The magic stat was used on physical units for weapons such as like Bolt Sword, Fire Sword, that game in particular, the Wind Sword, Earth Sword, and Light Brand specifically carried off of magic, which was very valuable in certain circumstances. Thracia, even more so, with the Fire Sword, Bolt Sword, Light Brand as well, being magical. And then the GBA games combined magic and strength into a single stat. If you were a magic unit, your power stat was magic. If you were a physical unit, your power stat was strength, and it just took up the same stat slot effectively, and there was no crossover. The only thing you had was the Rune Sword. I think technically dealt magic damage, as did the Light Brand, although depending on what game you were playing, what version of the engine, the Light Brand specifically worked slightly differently. Then you got to Path of Radiance, which split strength and magic again, and gave physical units the... Let me see, it was the Bolt Axe, Flame Lance, and Wind Sword, or Sonic Sword, in order to give a sort of a triangle that matched the magic triangle, but in weapons. And then you had Radiant Dawn, which gave a lot more attention to... It tried a lot more things with its weapons. They gave us Bronze Swords, it gave us Wind, Storm, and Tempest Edge, Sword, and Blade specifically for ranged swords for normal units that weren't legendary weapons, and it gave us the cards. So the cards have never returned. Nothing like them has ever returned. The only other offensive item technically is the mine, and the mine has other issues that we can discuss in a later video maybe. But the cards were really interesting. Basically what it was is that the card hung out in your item part of your inventory. Radiant Dawn had a split inventory for weapons for items, just like Fire Emblem 1... Was it 1? No, not 1. Fire Emblem 3 and Fire Emblem Path of Radiance had a split inventory. The rest of them had 5 or sometimes 6, I think usually 5 item inventories that dealt with items and weapons. But so cards hung out in the item slot of your inventory, and you could use them on player phase to use a magical attack. It was 1 to 2 range, just like attacking with a tome, using your magic stat against the target's resistance. And I believe it prevented... Yeah, target cannot counterattack. Cannot be wielded by magically oriented units. So this was an option for purely physical units, so not mages, not clerics, to use their magic stat to attack. The game also ended up having the Bolt Axe, Flame Sword, and I think it had a magical sword, but I forget I think it had a Sonic Sword, but I forget the specifics of where you got them. But it gave you a lot of these cards, and these cards had a decent value and a decent number of uses. Like the weakest one, the Spectre card, had 15 uses and was worth 3,000. The Reaper card had 10 uses and was worth 5,000, and the Daemon card, 5 uses, 5,000 as well, but then each use, took down that worth, and so basically each use was like 1,000 gold. So why did these cards show up once and never again, and why were they a failed mechanic? let's look into that. So Radiant Dawn is what I would describe as the origin of stat creep outside of FE4. FE4 is its own thing, but Radiant Dawn was really the first game in modern Fire Emblem to really raise stats and stat caps in particular. You could get stats as high as like 30s and into 40s in Radiant Dawn. Numbers that would be repeated in Awakening and Fates and Three Houses. And technically Echoes as well, though you had to, like... Echoes is more similar to Gaiden, but it still had the potential to go insane if you did in the post-game or through gross over-investment. But Radiant Dawn had very high stats, and a lot of enemies actually had something of a meaningful resistance stat, meaning hitting with even like a 12 might Daemon card, which sounds good, isn't going to do much, especially when it's only available either through the bargain shop in part 3 or through treasure in like hidden treasure or the endgame shop in part 4. Super late. The earliest card you get is a Spectre card in chapter 1 of part 2, so the map with Nephany, Braum, and Heather. Technically you get a Reaper card in endgame of Act 1 in a chest, but that's like the farthest, it's either the farthest upper left or upper right chest, and so you're never really going to have an opportunity to use it. And then everyone just kind of gets the cards, they go to your item slot, and then you forget about them. That's kind of what happens with these cards. Why did they get forgotten? Well, dealing a magic attack with like 12 base might on a unit that probably has like 5 or 6 magic, you're doing like 18 minus their resistance, which enemies actually have something of a resistance stat in Radiant Dawn. It's not like a lot of games where enemy resistance is like single digit at most, unless they're specifically a mage or a caster. It's like, no, a lot of enemies actually had reasonable resistance, especially like cavaliers, paladins, some foot units. The only units that didn't really have a lot of resistance were armor knights, but they tended to have a lot of hit points. And so you weren't really able to use these to kill them because, I believe you can't double with them. It says they can't crit and the target can't counterattack. I feel like you can't double with them, but you might have been able to double with them. I don't remember. I don't really use the cards either. Funnily enough, the one niche use the cards gave was with Heron units. If you really were in a bind and needed a Heron unit to attack, using the cards was actually a somewhat meaningful way of doing so, because Heron units actually had pretty reasonable magic stats, usually pretty high actually, because of, was it Blessing? At least one of them, if not most of them, had a skill which would restore hit points to adjacent allies at the start of turn equal to the Heron's magic stat. And so with that, you'd be able to get some decent damage out of a unit that normally couldn't attack. You're rarely going to use that because you'd often use the Heron to sing and refresh at least one unit, if not 2 or 4, because it's Radiant Dawn, and you either have Rayson, who can transform and sing for 4, Raphael, who can sing for 4 always, or Leanne, who can sing for 2 always. You're almost never going to be using them to attack unless, again, it's like very, very specific situations that you shouldn't normally really get into, that just would make it into a more viable action. But yeah, so the cards, they were too rare, they were too forgettable, they were worth more to sell than they were to use, almost always. You always felt bad using them for like chip damage because it's like, oh, well that's, 15 uses for 3,000. That 3,000 gold, yeah, you sell it back, it's 150 or 1,500, and then you can buy a couple weapons for that, or you can buy like a silver weapon for the cost of selling a Spectre card. And because every use reduced that value, you were very encouraged to not actually use it. So it ended up being one of those mechanics that it technically existed, but no one really engaged with, and for good reason, because it sucked. Do I think it could come back? I think they could honestly make cards have a comeback in a modern game, something like Three Houses or Engage. I think that having the option for an offensive item is interesting and has potential. I just think that in the games, in Radiant Dawn, I was going to say the games it was part of, but it just won. In Radiant Dawn, they were too weak and too expensive and too rare to really merit using. And also the units that could use them, because they were limited away from magical units, didn't really have a lot of magic. Some of the highest magic physical units you could have were, like, if I remember right, Zihark had a really high magic growth, or at least magic base. Nephany was pretty reasonable too. I remember because those are units that you would actually consider putting Imbue on, because Imbue was like renewal, but instead of 10% of your max HP, it would heal you based on your magic stat. And so, yeah, Zihark, Nephany, maybe there was like a meme build with Meg that used cards to some sort of effect. I don't remember. But yeah, there were only a handful of units that had, quote, good magic for a physical unit. And even those good magic units were like 8 or 10 at most magic. Like if you got like a 10, if you got like 12 magic on Zihark, you were ecstatic, over the moon. It's like, yes, finally, I have an imbue target that actually gets a somewhat meaningful dose of HP every turn. The magic stats in that game were so low for physical units in general that you were rarely able to really make use of cards in an effective way. And by the time those magic stats were high enough, enemy hit points were so high that the cards couldn't do meaningful damage. You were just using forged weapons like forged steels, forged silvers, or other really powerful weapons like you had great weapons, blades, great lances, stuff like that, or killer weapons. Or you would be attacking and trying to proc skills like Impale or Astra or Aether or stuff like that if you had like a third tier unit. And so ultimately the cards lost their niche by not being available when the niche was impactful, and by just being way too weak. Honestly, I feel like they could probably have doubled the might of these cards, and they still might not see any use, but they'd at least have some merit. But let me know what you think about the Spectre, Reaper, and Demon cards. Do you want them to make a return? Have you ever found a use for them in Radiant Dawn outside of selling them for money? Let me know in the comments down below. Until then, this is Mythros signing out.